The cloth in Rosalind Parker's hand was stained a deep, dark crimson. She pressed it to her split lip, the sting a sharp reminder of the night before. In the crooked mirror on her bedroom wall, a stranger stared back, a ghost with hollow eyes and bruises blooming like poison flowers across her skin. This was Wyoming, 1878, and this was not the life she had been promised. 3 years ago, Thomas Parker had wooed her with visions of security and respect. A grand house on a hill overlooking the dusty town of Hollow Creek. He was a cattle baron, a man of wealth and power, a man who owned everything he saw, including, she now understood, her. The golden cage had slammed shut the moment the ring was on her finger, and with every passing season, her husband's temper grew shorter and his fists grew harder. Last night had been the worst. "Worthless fool," he'd snarled, his breath a foul mix of whiskey and rage. "Think I don't know you've been sneaking around?" His fist connected with her jaw, and the world went white for a moment. Planning to leave me? She hadn't been. Not yet. Her secret meetings were with Margaret Riley, the shopkeeper's wife. She was teaching the poor woman to read. But in Thomas's twisted mind, any life she had outside of him was a betrayal, an act of war. Now, in the pale morning light, Rosalind made a decision. She couldn't survive another winter trapped in this house with that man. 3 years of fear had hollowed her out, scraped her soul down to the bone. It was time to run. Her hands trembled as she packed a small valise. Just one dress, a change of undergarments, a faded photograph of her parents, her mother's silver hairbrush, and $43. $43 she'd scraped together, one hidden coin at a time, in the false bottom of her sewing box. It was a pathetic sum for 3 years of marriage to a rich man, but it would have to be enough. She waited. Every tick of the grandfather clock in the hall was a hammer blow against her ribs. Finally, she heard the front door slam shut. Thomas was gone, on his way to a cattle auction 2 towns over. He wouldn't be back until tomorrow. This was her only chance. She slipped out the kitchen door, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her chest. The September air was cold, a chilling promise of the winter to come. She pulled her thin shawl tight and kept her head down, scurrying away from the grand house like a frightened mouse. She walked past the church, its white steeple like a judgmental finger pointing to the sky. She walked toward the stagecoach office at the very edge of town. "Morning, Mrs. Parker," a voice called out. It was Mr. Finley, the hardware store owner, sitting on his porch. She raised a hand but didn't slow down, didn't dare turn her face toward him. The bruises would invite questions, questions that could get her killed. The stagecoach office was empty, save for the ticket agent, a balding man who didn't even look up from his ledger. "When's the next coach leaving town?" she asked, her voice surprisingly steady. "Noon stage to Riverbend," he mumbled. "Then on to Laramie if you're heading west." "Riverbend will do," she said, sliding her precious money across the worn wooden counter. She'd heard of it. A growing town, a place where the railroad was bringing new people, new opportunities. Maybe a place where a woman who could read and write could find work. Maybe a place where Thomas Parker couldn't find her. The agent finally looked up. His eyes widened for a fraction of a second as he saw her face. The split lip, the swollen cheek, the dark shadow under her eye. Then, just as quickly, his expression went blank. It was a look she knew well, the silent, awkward recognition of a man's property being damaged, followed by the swift decision to mind one's own business. "That'll be $3, he said, his voice flat. He wrote out the ticket. "Stage leaves at noon sharp. Be here by 11:30. She took the ticket, her lifeline, and tucked it into her handbag. 3 hours. She had 3 hours to wait. 3 hours for someone to notice the lady of the manor was gone. 3 hours for one of Thomas's loyal men to spot her and drag her back to that house. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't go anywhere in town. Every pair of eyes was a potential spy. So she walked to the edge of town to a small creek that ran past a grove of cottonwood trees. It was a quiet place. She settled onto a flat rock and watched the water, trying to force her heart to slow down. She had to stay calm. But then she heard it. The sound of hoofbeats. Rosalind's blood ran cold. She scrambled to her feet, ready to bolt into the trees. But it wasn't one of Thomas's men. It was a stranger. A tall man on a chestnut horse, his face hidden in the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. He reined his horse in at the water's edge to let it drink. Rosalind tried to slip away unnoticed, but the rustle of her dress caught his attention. He turned, and for the first time, she saw his face. It was weathered by the sun, with a strong jaw covered in a few days of stubble. But his eyes were a piercing blue. He tipped his hat. "Beg your pardon, ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Didn't mean to disturb you." "You're not," she replied automatically, keeping her face turned away, hoping the brim of her bonnet would hide the worst of the marks. But the man was observant, too observant. His gaze sharpened, taking in her formal dress, the small valise at her side, the raw tension in her posture. "You all right, ma'am?" he asked, and his voice was suddenly gentle. "I'm fine," she lied, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. The stranger dismounted in one smooth, practiced motion. He kept his distance, but he was close enough now, close enough to see everything. His expression darkened as he saw her bruised face clearly. But it wasn't pity she saw in his eyes. It was something else. A flash of cold, controlled anger. "Name's Samuel Reed," he said. He gestured to a satchel on his horse. "Got some water and jerky if you're hungry." She hesitated. Every lesson from her childhood screamed at her not to trust strange men in lonely places. But something in his steady gaze, in the respectful way he stood, made her pause. "Rosalind Parker," she replied. "And no, thank you. I'm not hungry." He nodded, not pushing. "Waiting on someone, Mrs. Parker?" "The noon stage," she heard herself say. Why did she tell him that? Samuel glanced up at the sun. "That's a fair wait. Mind if I rest a spell?" She gestured vaguely at the creek. "It's not my land, Mr. Reed." A small smile touched his lips. "Just Samuel is fine." He let his horse drink, his back to her, but she felt his awareness. He was watching her, even when he wasn't looking. "Headed somewhere in particular?" "Riverbend," she said. The name felt foreign, a prayer for a place she'd never seen. He nodded slowly. "Good town, growing fast." He turned back to face her, his blue eyes unreadable. "I've got a small ranch about 10 miles outside it." She felt a flicker of surprise. "You're from Riverbend?" "For the past 5 years," he confirmed. "Came west after the war. Had some business here in Hollow Creek, but I'm headed home now." He paused, his gaze fixed on her. "Stage is a mighty uncomfortable ride, ma'am. My wagon is parked at the livery. I'd be happy to offer you a ride instead." Rosalind stiffened. The offer was too convenient, too perfect. This man, appearing out of nowhere, knowing exactly where she was going. It felt wrong. "I don't know you, Mr. Reed." "No, ma'am, you don't," he agreed easily, his voice calm. "And a lady has to be careful." He looked her straight in the eye. "Tell you what, I'll be at the livery until 11 o'clock. If you change your mind, the offer stands. No pressure either way." He tipped his hat again, swung himself onto his horse, and rode off toward town, leaving her alone by the creek with a choice that felt more like a trap. Was he an angel of mercy? Or was he something else entirely? The next 2 hours were the longest of Rosalind's life. Every shadow seemed to hold one of Thomas's men. Every gust of wind sounded like her name being called. The kind stranger's offer echoed in her mind. A wagon ride was faster, more direct, less public. But was it safer? As 11 o'clock approached, she made her choice. Staying in Hollow Creek was a death sentence. The stagecoach felt exposed. The stranger was a risk, but he was a risk that led away from here. She walked back into town, sticking to the alleyways, her heart in her throat. Samuel was at the livery stable, just as he'd said. He was loading supplies into a sturdy wagon, hitched to two strong draft horses. He looked up as she approached, his face giving nothing away. He didn't smile in triumph. He simply waited, letting the choice be hers. "The stage costs $3, she said, her voice clipped. "I'll pay you the same to take me to Riverbend." He shook his head. "I'm headed that way regardless, Mrs. Parker. I won't take your money. I don't accept charity." A slight smile played on his lips. "How about a trade, then? I've got bread and cheese for the journey. You can share my meal with me as payment." It was a clever way to save her pride. She found herself nodding. "Very well." He offered his hand to help her up to the wagon seat. His palm was calloused, his grip strong but gentle. As they pulled out of the livery, Rosalind scanned the street, half expecting to see Thomas riding toward them, his face a mask of fury. But the street was empty. They left Hollow Creek without anyone stopping them. The wagon rolled on, the miles stretching between her and her prison. For the first hour, they rode in silence. Rosalind began to relax, just a little. The constant fear that had been her companion for 3 years started to loosen its grip. "My father raised horses back in Virginia," Samuel said, answering a question she hadn't realized she'd asked aloud about his skill with the team. "And please, it's Samuel." "Samuel," she repeated. "Were you a cavalryman in the war?" He nodded, his eyes on the horizon. "Union, Western theater, lost a lot of good men." His expression grew distant, clouded by memories she couldn't begin to imagine. "What about you, Mrs. Parker? You're not from Hollow Creek, I'd wager." "Missouri," she said. "My father was a school teacher. He and my mother died of typhoid 5 years ago. I'm sorry for your loss." She gave a small, bitter shrug. "With no family left, I accepted a marriage proposal from a man who promised me a good life in Wyoming." Her voice went flat. "Thomas Parker." She watched his hands. As she said the name, his knuckles went white on the reins. It was a small movement, almost imperceptible. But she saw it. His voice, however, remained gentle. "Those bruises suggest he's not a man of his word." She turned to face him, a spark of defiance in her eyes. "Are you judging me, Samuel, for staying so long?" "No, ma'am," he said, his voice firm, his blue eyes meeting hers. "I don't judge folks for doing what they have to do to survive." He paused, and his next words hit her like a physical blow. "And I don't judge them for choosing to stop surviving and start living." The truth of it stunned her into silence. For 3 years, she had done nothing but survive. "I don't know if I remember how," she whispered. His gaze was steady, compassionate. "The bruises will fade. The fear takes longer, but it fades too." He looked away toward the mountains in the distance. "My sister, she married a man like that. A man with a heavy hand and a cruel heart." Hope flickered in her chest. "What happened to her?" "I helped her get away," he said, his voice hardening slightly. "Sent her to California. She has her own hat shop now, a good life." He turned back to her. "She built a new life, Rosalind, and you will too." They stopped at midday to rest the horses. Samuel spread a blanket, and they ate bread and cheese in the shade of a cottonwood tree. He was easy to talk to. He knew the land, pointed out distant landmarks, told her stories of the trail. He seemed to be a simple, kind man. A good man. But she couldn't shake the memory of his hands tightening on the reins when she said Thomas's name. It was a flicker of something dark, something hidden. He said he had business in Hollow Creek. He'd never said what it was. As they packed up to leave, she decided to ask. "What sort of business did you have in my town, Samuel?" she asked, trying to sound casual. He stilled for a moment, his back to her. Then he turned, and the easy smile was gone. His eyes were serious, guarded. "I was looking for a man," he said slowly, "a man who owes a debt." A cold dread washed over her. "What man?" Samuel held her gaze. "A cattle baron, a man of wealth and power." He took a step closer. "A man named Thomas Parker." Rosalind's breath caught in her throat. This was no coincidence. This man, this kind stranger who had appeared like a miracle, hadn't just stumbled upon her. He had been looking for her husband. And suddenly, she felt like she had just jumped out of the frying pan and into the fire. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The gentle rancher persona dissolved before her eyes. The man standing in front of her was harder, colder. The compassion in his eyes was replaced by a sharp, calculating intelligence. "I'm not a rancher, Rosalind," he said, his voice low and even. "My name is Samuel Reed, and I'm an agent with the Pinkerton National Detective Agency." Pinkerton. The name was famous. Hired guns. Private detectives who hunted men for money. Her rescuer wasn't a rescuer at all. He was a hunter, and his prey was her husband. "What does the Pinkerton Agency want with Thomas?" she asked, her mind reeling. "A client in Cheyenne hired us, a railroad investor. He claims Thomas Parker swindled him out of a fortune in a land deal. Forged documents, false claims. My job was to go to Hollow Creek, gather evidence, and bring him in." It all clicked into place. The convenient appearance, the offer of a ride, his questions. He wasn't being kind. He was gathering intelligence. He had been using her. "And me?" she asked, bitterness rising in her throat. "Was finding a battered wife part of your plan? A convenient witness?" "No," Samuel said, and for the first time he looked genuinely unsettled. "Finding you, that was a complication. I saw your face and I remembered my sister. My professional duty got tangled up with my personal history. I acted on instinct." But which instinct? The one that helped a woman in need, or the one that saw a tool to be used? "What now?" she asked, pulling her shawl tighter around her, feeling more alone than ever. "Now you're the best lead I have," he said, his voice all business again. "Thomas Parker is a careful man. The town is in his pocket. Getting proof against him was going to be difficult. But you lived with him. You saw his business papers. You heard his conversations. You might know things you don't even realize you know." So that was it. She hadn't escaped at all. She had just traded one cage for another. She was no longer Thomas Parker's property. She was Samuel Reed's asset. They rode the rest of the way to Riverbend in a tense, heavy silence. The landscape that had seemed so full of promise just hours before now felt desolate and threatening. Riverbend was larger than Hollow Creek, a bustling town full of life. But Rosalind felt no relief. Samuel didn't take her to his ranch. Instead, he led the wagon to a neat two-story house with a sign that read, "Hullbrook Boarding House, clean rooms, decent rates." An older woman with iron gray hair and piercing eyes met them at the door. "Mrs. Hullbrook," Samuel said with a nod. "This is Mrs. Rosalind Parker. She'll be staying with you for a while." The woman's sharp gaze took in Rosalind's bruised face, then flickered to Samuel. There was an unspoken understanding between them. This wasn't a simple boarding house, and Mrs. Hullbrook was no ordinary landlady. "I have a room ready," the woman said, her voice stern. $5 a week. Curfew is 9 sharp. She looked directly at Rosalind. "Your business is your own, Mrs. Parker, but you're safe here." The words were meant to be reassuring, but they felt like a warning. Safe from what? From Thomas? Or from the plans this Pinkerton agent had for her? That night, in a small, clean room that felt more like a cell than a sanctuary, Rosalind finally let herself weep. She had escaped a monster, only to be caught in the web of the man hunting him. The next few weeks were a strange limbo. Samuel arranged a job for her at the local mercantile, working for a kind man named Mr. Wilson. It gave her a sense of purpose, a routine, but she knew it was a pretense, a way for Samuel to keep her in Riverbend under his watch. He would visit her at the boarding house, always under the watchful eye of Mrs. Holbrook. They would talk in the parlor. He'd ask her questions about Thomas's business, about ledgers she might have seen, about visitors who came to the house late at night, about names she might have overheard. She answered his questions truthfully, pulling details from the corners of her memory. A trip to Cheyenne, a heated argument about a railroad survey, a locked drawer in Thomas's desk she was forbidden to touch. Each memory was a breadcrumb for Samuel. But as the weeks passed, something strange happened. The lines began to blur. Their conversations shifted from interrogations to actual conversations. He told her about his life, about the war, about the sister he'd saved. She found herself telling him about her father, the school teacher who had believed in educating his daughter. The bruises on her face faded. The fear in her heart began to recede. She started to see the man behind the Pinkerton agent, a man of quiet strength, of deep integrity, and she began to realize he was walking a fine line. He was using her, yes, but he was also protecting her. One crisp Sunday afternoon, he took her for a walk by the river. "I've been making inquiries," he said, discreetly. "Parker told everyone in Hollow Creek you went back east to visit sick relatives. He's more concerned with his reputation than with finding you." A wave of relief washed over her. "But he's not a man who lets go of what's his," Samuel continued, his expression grim. "He'll start looking eventually. We need to move faster." He stopped and turned to her. "I spoke with Judge Harmon here in Riverbend. He says you have grounds for divorce on the basis of cruelty." Divorce? The idea was shocking, radical, but it was also a spark of hope, true freedom. "What if Thomas fights it?" she asked. "Let him," Samuel said, a hard edge to his voice. "A public divorce proceeding would mean testimony. It would mean putting his affairs under a microscope. It's a way to attack him legally, to rattle his cage." She looked at him, at the determined set of his jaw, and understood. This wasn't just about her freedom. This was part of his plan. The divorce was a weapon, and she was the one who had to wield it. "I'll do it," she said, her voice stronger than she thought possible. But she had no idea what she was about to unleash. The divorce papers were served, and Thomas Parker responded. Not with a letter from a lawyer, but with fire. A week after the papers reached Hollow Creek, the livery stable in Riverbend burned to the ground. It was the stable where Samuel kept his horses. The message was clear. "I know where you are, and I can reach you." Fear, cold and familiar, coiled in Rosalind's stomach. She had underestimated Thomas. He wasn't just a bully who hit his wife. He was something far more dangerous. Samuel was furious, not just at the loss of his horses, but at the threat to the town, the threat to her. "This changes things," he said, his face grim as they stood looking at the smoking ruins. "He's not going to fight this in a courtroom. He's going to fight it in the shadows." And he was right. 2 nights later, as Rosalind was walking back to the boarding house from the mercantile, a man stepped out of an alley. He was big, rough-looking, and she'd never seen him before. "Mrs. Parker," he growled, "your husband sends his regards. He wants you to come home." Before she could scream, another figure emerged from the darkness. It was Samuel. He moved with a speed and efficiency that was terrifying. There was no argument, no warning, just a blur of motion and the sickening thud of a fist hitting bone. The man from the alley crumpled to the ground. Samuel grabbed her arm. "We have to go. Now!" He pulled her through the back alleys of Riverbend, his movements swift and silent. They didn't go to the boarding house. They went to a small, nondescript house at the edge of town she'd never noticed before. Inside, Mrs. Holbrook was waiting, a shotgun resting in the crook of her arm. The formidable landlady was clearly more than she appeared. "They'll be watching the boarding house," Samuel said, breathing heavily. "You'll stay here. It's a safe house." Rosalind's world was spinning. Safe houses. Thugs in alleys. This wasn't just about a divorce anymore. "What is going on, Samuel?" she demanded. "What is Thomas involved in that requires all of this?" Samuel looked at Mrs. Holbrook, who gave a slight nod. He turned back to Rosalind, his face etched with worry. "The swindled railroad money was just the beginning," he said. "We believe Thomas Parker is the head of a massive cattle rustling operation that stretches across the territory. He bribes officials, has a network of gunmen, and silences anyone who gets in his way. The man I was sent to investigate isn't just a swindler, Rosalind. He's a kingpin, and by running away and filing for divorce, you've declared war on his entire empire." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. She remembered the late-night visitors, the hushed, angry conversations, the sudden trips Thomas would take with his men. It had all been happening right under her nose. She had been married to a monster, and she'd never even seen the true shape of him. "The locked drawer," she whispered, the memory suddenly sharp and clear. "In his study." Samuel's eyes locked onto hers. "What about it?" "He kept a different ledger in there. Not the official ranch books. A smaller one, bound in black leather. He made me fetch it for him once. I saw names, numbers, columns that didn't make sense." A grim smile touched Samuel's lips. "That's it. That's the real record of his operation. If we can get that book, we can bring down everything." But the book was in Hollow Creek, in the house she'd run from, in the heart of the serpent's den. "It's too dangerous," Samuel said immediately. "He'll have men watching the house." "But he doesn't know that I know about the book," Rosalind insisted, a desperate plan forming in her mind. "He thinks I'm just a frightened wife. He would never suspect me of going back there to steal his secrets." "Absolutely not," Samuel said, his voice firm. "You don't have a choice," she shot back, surprised by her own fire. "Your investigation is stalled. His men are here, in this town. We can't just sit here and wait for them to find us. We have to take the fight to him." She looked him straight in the eye. "I know that house better than anyone. I know its secrets. I know where he hides things. You need me, Samuel." He stared at her for a long moment, a battle raging in his eyes between the protective man and the pragmatic agent. Finally, the agent won. "All right," he said, his voice heavy with reluctance. "But we do it my way." The plan was insane. They would use the upcoming Christmas social in Riverbend as cover. Everyone would be there, distracted. Under the cover of the party and a brewing snowstorm, they would slip out of town and ride for Hollow Creek. Mrs. Holbrook would stay behind, creating the illusion that Rosalind was sick in her room. The night of the social arrived, and with it, the first flakes of a heavy snow. It was a perfect night for a ghost to return to her haunting grounds. They rode hard, the wind whipping the snow around them, the world reduced to a swirling vortex of white and black. Hollow Creek was a ghost town, its residents hunkered down against the storm. The big house on the hill was dark, save for a single lamp burning in a downstairs window. "He's there," Samuel whispered, his breath clouding in the frigid air. "We wait for him to go to sleep." They waited in the freezing darkness of the stable, the minutes stretching into an eternity. Finally, the lamp downstairs was extinguished, and a new one appeared in the upstairs bedroom window. A few minutes later, it too went dark. "Now," Samuel said. Rosalind led him to a small, rarely used side door, the key to which she still had, a forgotten artifact from her old life. The lock turned with a faint click that sounded like a gunshot in the silent night. They slipped inside. The house was cold and still, filled with the ghosts of her past life. Every creak of the floorboards was a scream. The air was thick with the familiar smell of stale whiskey and Thomas's cigars. She led Samuel to the study. The door was unlocked. The room was just as she remembered it. Dark wood, leather chairs, the massive oak desk dominating the space. The bottom right drawer. It was locked, just as she'd said. Samuel knelt, pulling a set of slender metal tools from his coat. He worked with quiet, intense focus. After a few agonizingly long moments, there was a soft click. The lock was open. Samuel pulled the drawer open, and they both froze. It was empty. The black leather ledger was gone. A cold, sickening dread filled Rosalind. It was a trap. He knew. He had to have known they were coming. And then they heard it. A slow, deliberate creak from the floorboards in the hallway, just outside the study door. Samuel was on his feet in an instant, his pistol drawn. He pushed Rosalind behind him, his body a shield. They stood in the suffocating darkness, listening, their hearts pounding in unison. The doorknob began to turn. The door swung open, and a figure stood silhouetted in the dim light from the hall. It wasn't one of Thomas's thugs. It was the shopkeeper's wife, Margaret Riley, the woman Rosalind had been teaching to read. And in her hand, she held a pistol, pointed directly at them. "Margaret?" Rosalind breathed, her mind struggling to make sense of the scene. "What are you doing?" The woman's face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "I'm sorry, Rosalind," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He made me. He told me you'd come back." "Where is he, Margaret?" Samuel asked, his voice low and steady, his own gun never wavering. Before she could answer, a voice boomed from the darkness of the hallway behind her, a voice that haunted Rosalind's nightmares. "Right here, you fool!" Thomas Parker stepped into the doorway, a massive shotgun in his hands. He was smiling, a cruel, triumphant smirk. He had them. He had won. "You really thought it would be that easy?" Thomas sneered, his eyes full of hate fixing on Rosalind. "My timid little mouse, suddenly grown claws. Did you think I wouldn't find out about your little plot?" He took a step into the room, shoving Margaret Riley aside. "This little bird here sings whenever I tell her to." He gestured with the shotgun toward the terrified woman. "Her husband has quite a debt at the general store, a debt I own." It was a perfect web. Thomas owned the town, its people, their debts, their loyalties. "And you," Thomas said, turning his gaze to Samuel. "The Pinkerton man. I've been expecting you. You've been a nuisance." He hefted the shotgun. "A nuisance I'm about to eliminate." But Samuel wasn't looking at Thomas. He was looking past him, at something over his shoulder. A flicker of confusion crossed Thomas's face. And in that split second of distraction, Samuel moved. He shoved Rosalind hard, sending her stumbling behind the heavy oak desk as the room exploded with the deafening roar of the shotgun. Splinters flew from the wall where her head had just been. Samuel fired his own pistol, but Thomas was already moving, using the big desk for cover. The study became a death trap, filled with thunder and flashes of gunpowder. Rosalind, crouched behind the desk, her ears ringing, saw Margaret Riley huddled in the corner, sobbing in terror. But then she saw something else. Through the gun smoke, she saw the fireplace. And she remembered. Thomas had always been paranoid about fire. He'd had a secret compartment built into the stone of the hearth. A fireproof safe, he'd called it, for his most important papers. She had to get to it. While the two men exchanged fire, she crawled on her hands and knees across the floor, the smell of gunpowder thick in her throat. She reached the hearth, her fingers searching for the loose stone she had seen him use only once. Her hand closed around it. She pulled. It came free, revealing a dark, square cavity. And inside, sitting alone in the darkness, was the black leather ledger. She had it. "Samuel!" she screamed, holding the book aloft. "I have it!" Thomas roared in fury and turned his attention from Samuel to her. He raised the shotgun, taking aim. This was it. This was the end. But then a third shot rang out. It wasn't from Samuel's pistol or Thomas's shotgun. It was a smaller, sharper crack. Thomas Parker froze. His eyes went wide with disbelief. He looked down at his chest, where a small, dark red circle was rapidly blossoming on his white shirt. He staggered backward, the shotgun slipping from his fingers and clattering to the floor. He crumpled into a heap, his malevolent reign over Hollow Creek ending not with a bang, but with a choked, surprised gasp. Rosalind stared, her mind unable to process what had just happened. Then she looked toward the source of the shot. Margaret Riley stood in the doorway, the small pistol still clutched in her trembling hands, smoke curling from its barrel. The terrified woman, the pawn in Thomas's game, had fired the killing shot. "He was going to kill you," Margaret whispered, tears streaming down her face. "After everything you did for me, I couldn't let him." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of the wind howling outside. It was over, truly over. Samuel moved quickly, checking Thomas's body. He was dead. Samuel then gently took the pistol from Margaret's unresisting hand. "You saved our lives, Margaret," he said softly. Rosalind got to her feet, clutching the black ledger to her chest like a shield. She looked down at the body of the man who had tormented her, and felt nothing. No pity, no sorrow, not even satisfaction. Just a vast, empty relief. The ledger contained everything: names, dates, payoffs. It was the key that unlocked Thomas Parker's entire criminal enterprise. With the kingpin dead and his records in the hands of the law, his empire crumbled overnight. Officials were arrested, his network of thugs was rounded up, and the dark shadow he had cast over the Wyoming territory finally receded. Margaret Riley was hailed as a hero. Her testimony, combined with the ledger, ensured that Thomas's entire operation was dismantled. She and her husband, freed from their debt, left Hollow Creek to start a new life elsewhere. And Rosalind, she was finally, completely free. The legal proceedings took months. As Thomas's widow with no other heirs, she inherited what was left of his legitimate assets after the government seized the criminal proceeds. It was a substantial fortune, a fortune built on fear and cruelty, but one she was determined to use for good. She never went back to Hollow Creek. She sold the house and the ranch without ever setting foot on the properties again. Her new life was in Riverbend. With the inheritance, she bought a vacant storefront on Main Street. She transformed it into a bookshop and reading room, a place of learning and community. She called it Prairie Sky Books. It became the heart of the town, a place where people gathered not just to buy books, but to share ideas and dream of a better future. Samuel Reed's work in Wyoming was done. The Pinkerton Agency offered him a promotion, a prestigious post back in Chicago. He turned it down. He'd found something in the Wyoming territory he wasn't willing to leave behind. 1 year after that terrible night in the study, Samuel stood with Rosalind on the porch of the small, comfortable ranch he had bought 10 miles outside of Riverbend. The bookshop was thriving, managed by a bright young woman Rosalind had hired and trained. They were married now. Their partnership, forged in danger and sealed in justice, had blossomed into a deep and abiding love. Rosalind rested her head on his shoulder, her hand on her gently swelling belly. She looked out at the vast, open prairie, the endless blue sky stretching from horizon to horizon. "He told me once that he owned everything he could see," she said softly, thinking of Thomas. Samuel wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "He was wrong," he murmured, his lips against her hair. "He never owned the sky." She had escaped the cage. She had faced the monster. And in the end, she had found not just survival, but a life of her own making, under a sky that belonged to no one but itself. She had healed, not because a rescuer had saved her, but because she had found the strength to save herself. Her journey had been one of terror and darkness, but it had led her here, home, free, and loved. If you enjoyed Rosalind's incredible story of survival and justice, and want to hear more strange, dark, and mysterious tales from the pages of history, Be sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what's coming next.